It's an absolute honor to be invited to chat to you this morning, particularly as somebody north of the border. It's really lovely to hear your amazing accents as well. Um, I just want to chat for 10 minutes or so about sort of really where I come from and what nature means to me, particularly rivers as well. And if I get a chance towards the end, I'd like to share with you like a really important conversation that's happening across the world at the minute, which is the idea that we should be given legal rights to nature. Um, and I think that's reflecting the idea that a lot of our environmental laws don't really work. Um, and also like a deeper reflection that, you know, maybe Western society at the minute thinks that we didn't come out of the earth, we came to the earth, that we're superior to nature, that we're different from nature. And I suppose for most of my life, I'm not deeply intellectual or anything like that. I just felt it's like the most normal thing to believe that we are nature and nature is us. And I haven't really sort of seen that separation. Like my most vivid memories of growing up were like a tiny river, and I still live in a small town. I live in a town called Killaloe in County Down. I don't know if you've seen that big sea loch on the weather forecast, but southeast of Belfast called Strangford Loch. It's a huge loch, not as big as Loch Ness, which is biggest lake in these islands, and we can talk about what's happening to Loch Ness because I know it's been in the news recently. But I still live in that wee town, and the river is just about 400 yards over there. And when we were at school, we walked along the side of the river, and it was filled with sticklebacks, little tiny fish, um, tiny eels that migrate from the Sargasso Sea, from the Caribbean. They may have been 2 to 3 inches long, and you would see the odd jump of a trout as well. So it certainly wasn't very rich with wildlife, but there was quite a lot of things, and we used to catch these little creatures on the way back. And on the shoreline of Strangford Loch, where the river goes in again, about a couple of hundred yards beside me here, that was our playground. And there was literally nothing else to do. Like there was no mobile phones. There was TV was awful. Like we just had TV and stuff. There was literally nothing else to do. And then the troubles in Northern Ireland were flaring up. And what do? You have to run away somewhere. And I would run away to this river, and then the river fed into a lake, and I started fishing there and things. So nature wasn't something that was outside of us. It was like part of us. And I think for my parents' generation, the river was even more important because salmon came up the river then, to breed. There was sea trout. I think for my grandparents, all those decades and decades ago, it would have been very different. And I think one of the problems at the minute, scientists call it shifting baseline syndrome, is that uh, we are what we see. If you see lots of wildlife, lots of clean water that you could even swim in, how many rivers can you swim in? I brought my kids to Denmark recently, and well, they're big kids now, like, and one of the things it said in the canals around Copenhagen, if it's hot, you can jump in the canal and swim. Like, how many canals or rivers do we have left in Ireland that you could even swim in, that you could drink the water from? Something really awful has happened in the last 10 to 20 to 30 years. But to me, growing up, it seemed obvious that if we poison a river, then we're poisoning ourselves. And I'm a campaigner. I work for Friends of the Earth, and there's an amazing sign that happened during a protest in the States. It was against an oil pipeline, and there was a lot of indigenous people come out, and they held this sign, and it says "Water is life." And to me, that just, we're mostly water. We can't survive without clean water. We can't survive without clean air. These are really basic, fundamental things. So when we saw that sign, we started making the signs because most of the environmental damage in Northern Ireland is against water, it's against our rivers, against our lakes, and it's ultimately against ourselves. So for me, I think it's not just about changing the law. It's going back to an earlier idea in Ireland that um, these habitats aren't things, they're not objects, but they're relatives. And I would go even further. I think a lot of the poetry and a lot of the songs and a lot of our culture as well reflects the fact that rivers and the ocean, they carry our stories and our memories. Um, so I think in general, I think it's important that, say, if we take a river, that it's not enough to be part of nature, but to think that we are with nature. And maybe that sounds a wee bit crazy. And maybe 10 years ago, you would have been locked up for talking like this. But there is a growing movement in Ireland. It's possible that the Irish Constitution will change in the next year or so to recognise the rights of nature. And I suppose that is a question like, should nature have rights? Should nature have legal rights? Because it doesn't at the minute. So if I see a slurry tanker emptying its slurry into the river beside me, that slurry tanker, and that will kill the river. If it empties or even cleans itself in the river. But that slurry tanker has rights. There was some trees that were cut down recently beside the river here. Lots of local people got really, really upset. I was really upset. But the chainsaw that cut down the trees had legal rights to exist, but the river didn't have legal rights to exist. If there's, pollution coming from a factory, the people who own the factory, they have legal rights to be protected, but the river itself doesn't have any legal rights to be protected because our environmental laws at the minute are based on the idea that nature is property. And if you own property, the more property you own, the more you can ruin and destroy. And also the idea that we look at nature as property rather than part of us and we're part of nature is probably the fundamental problem. In a few years ago, 2017, in New Zealand, a really interesting law was passed for a river. I can't pronounce the river. I'm sorry. I have it written down here somewhere. The Wangani River. And it was a groundbreaking law because it granted legal personhood, it's called, to the river itself. So the river had a right to exist, to flourish, to evolve, to be itself, basically. Whereas our current laws view nature as a resource, as an object, as a piece of property. And because it's regarded as property, it's worth more dead than alive, in my opinion. It's a thing beyond us. It doesn't recognize nature or rivers as living beings. So I'm sort of inviting you into the idea that, can nature have rights? And there is a growing movement in Ireland. It's very young. It's only in the last couple of years, but it is a growing movement that's beginning to realize that unless we work with nature, unless we see ourselves as part of nature, unless we see nature as a relative rather than an object, then our current environmental problems may never be addressed. We have lots of environmental laws in Ireland, but rarely do the governments ever apply them. And a rights of nature law probably won't solve things either because, we're on a collision course between our, the idea of constant economic growth, taking and taking and taking from the land and the rivers and the lakes and the earth itself. We're in a collision course with nature and protecting ourselves. But I think the idea of a rights of nature law is really important, but mainly because it invites us to think about who we are as people, how we relate to our communities, and what our communities are. Our communities aren't just humans. Our communities are also what I heard you talking about, the oak trees, the hedges, the insects. because without those, then we can't exist. So there's a really fundamental reason as well why we should be having this important conversation. When I think about the rights of nature, it's about the rights of people as well and the rights of human communities, because we are nature and nature is us.